Good evening. I am delighted to see so many of you here tonight for this wonderful presentation. And I'm a personal fan of Thomas Heatherwick's, and so it's great for Asia Society Hong Kong to welcome him back. I don't know if some of you were here about. I think we were reminiscing, it must have been about 7 or 8 years ago. We have a Kayin Lo lecture series, and I think Kayin invited Thomas to speak on the Garden Bridge project. And we had a full house at Jockey Club Hall. And so we would love to have it at Jockey Club Hall tonight, but there's another event there. So we are so delighted that Miller Theater is available. And again, tonight's crowd is exactly why Asia Society Hong Kong is here. We're about education, and we're really delighted that somebody like Thomas, who is here for the Business of Design Week, can spare time to talk to us about his new book, which you'll hear more about from Donna in a little bit. But I think this, and you also saw some of the programs that upcoming. In fact, this is not our last program for December. We still have several, so please sign up for that kind of program. But for me, I wanted to really kind of pay tribute to Thomas Heatherwick, because I walk by Pacific Place every day. And I see his work, and there is something about, and I remember being at Pacific Place in the 90s before Thomas did his work, and now, and it just, there is a difference. And to be able to kind of, and I also count myself very lucky to be working in this complex designed for us by Billy Zinn and Todd William, to live, especially during COVID. When many of you were working from home, me and my staff, we look forward to coming to work. We could still work in this wonderful complex that has really great public space, and that is something that Mr. Heatherwick Thomas is famous for. Whether it's Little Island, which I had the pleasure of last year seeing a musical performance in the theater at Little Island, and that is really a memorable experience. Or earlier this year in Tokyo, visiting my friends in Tokyo, Azabuda Hills, some of the wonderful things that he's designed, the buildings, whether it's a building or the public space. So I think that's really important, especially post-COVID, the experience. And I think this is something that his work really brings out. So we're really delighted that we can continue to host programs like this. And please support us if you're not a member. And even if you're not a member, it's okay. Still come to our program. And we're going to be bring you a lot more programs coming up, whether it's related to arts and culture or design or business and policy. So with that, I'm really delighted that we can collaborate with Donna, and also really thanking the British Chamber of Commerce as well for helping us. Jo, who's going to be co-moderating will be moderating the talk after Thomas's presentation. But again, thank you all for being here. And I'm right now, my pleasure to introduce Donna Ma, Marketing Communication Manager of Thames and Hudson Asia, who made the book possible. So Donna?
First of all, I want to say that I did not publish the book. However, Thames and Hudson is very proud to have published the book. We celebrate 75 years as an independent publisher this year, which is amazing for a publisher if you're not aware. And we're so proud of this book. This book comes from Heatherwick Studios, which you probably know a lot about, but you may learn some more if you have a look at the book. So the studio itself brings together architecture, urban planning, product design, and one more thing, interiors, in one creative workspace. So the work of the studio is really presented in this book, a beautiful book, over 600 pages, full color. I don't know what else to say. It's a book. But you've seen it. It's back there. All right. So Thomas's creative processes are actually embedded into the DNA of the studio itself. And that is really what we try to bring forth in this book. So I hope you all get a chance to look at it. Obviously, it's here for purchase, and then we will have a book signing at the gallery outside. When you were coming in, we passed the gallery, actually. So the book signing will not be here. It'll be at the gallery. So that's one thing to note. And what else did I want to tell you? I did want to tell you something else. Yes. Our moderator today is Jo Lusby. Jo is the co-founder of Pixie B, and she's also the chairperson at British Chamber for the, now I think I've got this right, it is the Creative and Retail Committee at the British Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. And we'd also like to thank Asia Society for this beautiful venue, and JLL for sponsoring the event as well. All right, so thank you everyone. Please enjoy, and I'd like to welcome Jo and Thomas to the stage.
Oops. Hello everybody, I'm Thomas and Jo. But actually I'm sparing Jo feeling like a spare part on stage. But I'm so grateful that you've all come along this evening, and Hong Kong is the other place I'd want to live in the world. Your amazing mountains that hold this city, I've come 120 times. That was what it took to do the toilets here and do the lift buttons and things like that at Pacific Place. But I learned so much, and in a way, a lot of the projects in the book are actually influenced by that kind of masterclass I had of working with people who really cared about how people come together, and emotional motivation and sort of the social science of people being together. And I've become even more passionate about that after COVID, where people were divided and separated, and learnt they could use technology to stay divided and separated. So the physical world that we share needs to be even more connecting with something in us to get us to think, no, I won't get a PhD lying in my bed. I'm going to go and be together with people. And yes, you can order all your food to your home, but maybe it's worth coming to places to see your fellow human. And so underneath all of this is an interest in, I think I've become more clear that our role in the world of architecture is as public servants to try to see yourself as a facilitator of places for people to not be scared of each other. And I think there's, in many parts of the world, we're just getting more and more divided, and the internet winds people up so they become very toxic with each other. So I'm talking too much. I've got 6 projects to show, and then maybe we're going to sit and have a conversation, hopefully with you. But the first project I was going to show is a project. These are the double-page spreads in the book. Each project sort of starts with a double-page spread and a provocation, and we managed to get in some of the most recent projects. And in Tokyo, we were asked to think about a whole district, and that felt like the hugest honor and hugest responsibility. And our challenge was that in where's it gone? In our site had taken 27 years for them to agree with all the owners and people on this piece of land that's right next to the Tokyo Tower to be part of something. They weren't kicking them out, pushing people aside and twisting everyone's arms. It took that long to form the agreements and bring people together. And we were trying to think, what's Tokyo missing? And one of the main things is that there isn't much green space. And so you get 1 or 2 really big parks and then hardly any other ones. So we were trying to think how we could build the buildings we needed to build, which included a school for 1,000 children. Actually, there's a new temple that needed to be built as part of the district, and there are already a shrine and 2 other temples around our site. We needed to make working space, living space, and also space for galleries and studio spaces. And so it was a funny piece of land. There was quite a slope on the piece of land. And we were thinking about how we could use it as an excuse to make the site greener than it ever was. And I've always loved when you go to gardens and they have pergola structures, and you get these square grids with plants growing through. And so we wondered whether that could be a way that we could make buildings that met the rules that buildings needed to meet and might facilitate people to feel that what we designed was buildable. But if we could make it three-dimensional, that same grid, we could use it to be park, be spaces and gathering spaces, but also grow up into the buildings that people could then walk up onto the roofs of or walk into. And so it took 9 years from the beginning to the end. And when I was little, 9 years seemed an impossible amount of time. You just thought, well, someone will just have a better idea halfway through. But 9 years went very quickly, actually. And so there are some larger bits and smaller bits that are the different parts of the project. And for example, so we could, what it meant is we had a system that meant that it might tolerate a development process, because every project that we work on feels like you're growing something together. And it's not you leading it or your client leading it or all your collaborators leading it together. You're trying to nurture this sort of delicate thing that could easily go completely wrong or not happen. But this system meant that we could massage it and like, oh, there's a shrine. Okay, let's fold it down there. So it's sort of welcoming you. So just up to the left is a historic shrine next to our site. But then we could make it feel that it wasn't just huge buildings slamming against you. We could let it sort of come down to meet you. That coming down to meet you felt really important. How could we make sort of commercial developments? We have that image of them as big, shiny, sterile things. And so we were trying to think how we could have something that could also be intimate. And that extended into also that small scale, trying to make bits that you can discover rather than so often places are sort of almost too planned, too clear, and you don't feel there's any discovery. So we wanted to use the funny things about this piece of land and mixing it with this idea for a sort of overarching idea that meant like a piece of funny gauze fabric. You could clip it and cut it and trim it, and it would make some surprise bits as you went around and put the different kinds of functions on it or in it. And so we also had pavilions that pushed through it, but it was possible to make something. So on the left is how, when you come out of the subway, that trellis structure actually drops down to a basement level. So you see almost the beginning of the whole project as you come out of the subway that grows up into the rest of that landscape that becomes the buildings. And we even had there's a 99-year-old who has lived on the site all his life, moved in on the day it launched, which was thrilling, and who's living in part of the project, the piece of the project you can see just there on the left. And we wanted, I suppose, we're really interested in particularity. It feels like so often in construction, things feel versions of the same constantly. And so we're always trying to see if we can sort of nurture something that can feel particular. And this grid going through itself, we wanted to let that be excuses for shadows and high points of light. And so like joinery, we let these beam pieces go through each other, but also enjoy that it could give us some funny bits. Because we're all children inside, and so often I think play is you have a play area for children, but we're all children inside. And just having these funny bits that you might wedge yourself in or hide from someone just felt like important in projects, to have the space for those idiosyncrasies and quirks. And then there's a performance space in the middle, and so I've always been interested in those quilling. It's a kind of unusual little craft where people get very fine shredded paper, a pad cut into a sliver, and the paper layers, when you bend them around, do gorgeous things. And that we just started experimenting in the studio, and that led to this canopy that means that you can have performances and markets and protected from rain and some of the sun. But underneath all of this in the project was this realization from the first time I went to Japan, which was how different it was to the UK from a geological point of view. In the UK, when you see buildings being built, you see these metal frames going up, and then you go to Japan and you see those metal frames going up, and they are enormous, brutal structures. And I'd never experienced seismic, earthquake proofing of buildings. And my old studio was on the railway lines in King's Cross in London. And I remember having a Japanese client come in, and our building kind of just shook every 3 minutes like this. And I remember they were there, and suddenly the building started shaking, and they all leaped up. And you suddenly thought, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you leaping up? And you realize that earthquakes are in the psyche. And then when I learned that when you're designing a building for an earthquake region, you have to think of it as this, when the steel structure is going up, it has to be strong enough that if you held it sideways, it wouldn't all flop. And once you had that in your head, you understood why the steel was, because that structure is going to be being shaken like this, which is the equivalent of sort of having it sideways. And suddenly your eyes made sense of why there was the, in effect, fat-ankled structure. And then when I went back to the UK and looked at these skinny little metal frames, and you thought, oh, what if there's an earthquake? There's little bandy-legged structures. So all of that is just to say, here in our thinking was, how can we embed that strength without looking like it's totally brutal? And because inside is big steel elements. And how do you make that strength that in your mind could be sideways and shaken and wouldn't collapse? So factors like that were there of how we can get qualities that can work in that. And final part of the project was also, we did a school for 1,000 children, and that sits alongside the thing that facilitated and funded the business model of this human scale area was the tower that's just to the right of this this school. So there was just the tallest tower in Japan next to a school for 1,000 children, just pushed up against each other. And that lovely thing of funny things next to each other, all being able to coexist, I think works well in the places that I think we're understanding that places with multi-uses all coming together work much better for us all as humans than places which are just office areas or just shopping areas or just education areas. So the second project is something I've never shown before, but in Shanghai we were commissioned to make a new exhibition building. And so we were really interested in how making an exhibition building on the west of the Bund, on the river, how could it be an excuse for people to walk up and get better views out of the river? And so we were growing the outside of the building so that it could make these stairways that shaped the building and lifted it up. And especially as exhibition buildings, they often don't want much daylight at all. And so that led to this design and looking at how could we make enough visual interest into the surface of it. And so working with just the project that I just showed you in Japan was precast panels, which had the interest when you got to a meter away was because of all the different pebble stones that we put into it to try and give some texture of fascination up close. And here, again, we were using a steel structure, but here using a panels where we were able to put in all these folds that flow around it, that give shadows and textures and high points of light, that can catch the light, but also you can then walk up it. So we're just in the process of putting the finishing touches to this project. And it's also planted on the way up, so that it should be nice as it's planted. So this project is in Shanghai, called 1,000 Trees. By the way, I never normally, I'm kind of giving my own game away each time by showing you the end and then telling you how we got there, which normally I never do. But as it felt like, okay, let's try this the other way around. But this project began from a site that was more than half a kilometre long, and where in an area with kind of tombstones of concrete towers all around. It isn't the Bund, it isn't the centre where you'd have a Louis Vuitton shop or something. And it's the same size as the Empire State Building lying on its side. And typically what always happens with new developments is you get podium boxes, and then you get an office tower, a hotel tower, residential tower, sticking off those boxes. And our role, the role of the architect designer, is to sort of decorate those boxes. And we were sort of wrangling as to, it felt this piece of green space there, and there was the art district just to the left. And it felt, we don't want to just be the cheesy development next to the art district. How can we be a real resource that's somehow a counterpoint to all these concrete tombstones around? And we needed 1,000 columns. We needed a column grid, just like I was talking about the grid that was driving the project in Tokyo, to allow a project to be buildable and meet all the functional requirements internally. Same requirement. How do you have space for car parking? How do you have space for workspace? Somewhere someone could sleep, where you could have a kindergarten, where you can have a karaoke bar or a beauty parlor or whatever these is in it. And got quite fascinated in many architecture projects. Your job is to hide the columns in the wall, hide the columns in a shop front, and kind of lose them. I was thinking, well, we've got these huge boxes, and instead of losing the column, we need 1,000 of these. What if we thought of them as our heroes instead of the things to sort of bury, and sort of make the skin of the building secondary? And so we started by thinking almost like a fakir's bed of nails, if you know what I mean. You know those, they often have them in cartoons or something. The idea you have loads of nails and somebody lies their body on it. We thought, well, what if we hammer in those 1,000 columns and we can shape them and push and pull them to the massing that the project needs? And we actually made a model. I should have brought a photograph of it. It's in the book. We made a spaghetti model. So we wedged together spaghetti in the shape of the site. So we could slide the spaghetti up and down so that we could massage it to get the shape that we wanted and that might work, and then test it and massage it some more. And luckily mice haven't eaten the model yet. But when thinking about the art district and thinking about the piece of park and the river that was there, it felt, how do we make the site greener than it was before? How do we not marginalize that little piece of park? And we had transplanted trees a number of times before and knew what trees need to survive and to potentially thrive. And so it was just green roofs. Sometimes buildings have green roofs, and that weight of all the water and the soil and the roots and the bushes and trees is really heavy. And if there was a green roof directly above us, the beams that hold that up would probably have to be deeper and the whole ceiling would come down. But we were thinking, well, if you've got something really heavy and you've got these columns, 1,000 of them, why don't you put the heavy thing on top of the column that goes down past the person sleeping, past the person working, past the children in the kindergarten and the person watching something in the little theatre, and down to the roots of the building? And so we thought, well, why don't we plant Chinese mountain trees, semi-mature Chinese mountain trees, on the top of every one of the columns? And that's how it became the project called 1,000 Trees. And the first half of it was completing a couple of years ago. The second half of it still has another year and a half, 2 years to go. But we have topped out, and the trees are in already. And the whole point really was to try to change relationships, to have a softer relationship to the river, the Suzhou Creek River, which had been cleaned up, which had been a decade or so ago, had been a very polluted river, and trying to make spots and intimacy, even though it's such a big building. Part of the problem, I think, in modern buildings is what do you do with bigness? And that's something we're grappling with in lots of projects, when the places we tend to love often are small, have the old towns where you get surprises and quirks. But when you get a big building and you're building something 400 meters long, how do you make that have human intimacy when humans are still the same size we were 1,000 years ago or 500,000 years ago? And so by setting the grid diagonally, it allowed us to make hundreds of outdoor terraces which could have different gathering spaces. Even every tenant, every space could have their own outdoor space. And actually we have our Shanghai studio there, run by my colleague who's here, and studio partner Craig who's here. And so we've got one of these courtyards, and we're next to a karaoke bar and a beauty parlour. And so on the city side, it's cut through. And we worked, because it's the art district next door, we worked with different street artists, and there were a few international people as well, so that we could embed that in the building. But part of the goal really was to try to make something that could invite people and form a place that you might want to explore, and it create a different kind of texture that was a counterpoint to big blocks, whether they're shiny glass blocks or aluminium and glass blocks or concrete and aluminium and glass blocks, and make different reflections and help a piece of city feel more particular. And yeah, this was when we were just completing that first part. So this is the first bit. The second part is almost twice as high as this, which you were seeing some of the first images. It's arriving. In London, we are just starting to get close to completing a project where we were using the last major Victorian exhibition halls of London called Olympia. And these were these big halls that got built one by one when the UK had its empire and had its certain mindset of the world coming to London. And this grew up sort of organically over time, but it ended up as a dead bit of London. Unless you were going to the cybersecurity show that's happening there specifically, or the cat food show or something like that, it's a dead place. And yet this is a place that's had Pink Floyd concerts. Muhammad Ali has fought here. They've filled it with ice, flooded the whole thing, military tattoos. The Queen went there hundreds of times. It sort of had roles in and was a chameleon, but it actually wasn't a place you would ever go to. And now we need places to bring us together to go to. And so when we were looking at this and thinking, well, how do we bring it alive? Our main thought was, it's jammed up. It's a dead bit of London. Everyone drives past it if they're going on their way to Heathrow from central London. And it's like the lights are off, unless there's a very specific niche interest. So our thought was, well, we could make 2.5 acres of new land if we could lift people up onto the shoulders of these buildings. And we proposed that, and they went for it, and the city planners went for it. And that meant we suddenly had a new street, a pedestrian street that's more than 200 meters long. And as part of the project, it grew so that we could then, at the very top of this image, we could build London's first new major theatre for 70 years with 1,500 seats. And we could build at bottom left and right 2 new hotels built into and onto the old Victorian structures. And then in the middle, we could build 60,000 square meters of new workspace and grow that up and grow it out of the Victorian halls. And actually, in fact, that's the Art Deco halls. And then we could also grow a third one. And we have these sort of big barrel vaults of glass, of this zigzag glass, which led to us saying, well, we've got to make people feel invited, and to make someone go up to this roof level, it's got to be really inviting. And so we're making this other roof vault. And so the project has been in construction now for 4 years, and the sort of heart of it is places that you could just wander around and you don't need a ticket or a funny piece of plastic hanging around your neck on a cord. And it will have thousands of people working there, and it has this street that goes through and underneath and connects to a new music hall as well, big music venue, and a theatre. And really it's all about connection, but it'll have a funny particularity that you lift up to go to this space. And this is the new theatre that we're building, and this is one of the pictures of the work as it is at the moment, as from last week. And this is one of the hotels built into the building, and then this is the first one of the layers of the working space coming out of the Art Deco hall. And we manipulated choosing a picture that also had our bus design in it. And this is one of that new hall piece that we've built for when you arrive up to the higher level. And what's the lesson we learned from Pacific Place? People like lift buttons more than you think. And when you don't have enough money to do everything you want to do, you can always afford lift buttons. And so that one of the biggest lessons was in the feed of hearing how people responded to Pacific Place was actually little details. And the money was tight on this project, and it didn't help that there was a war in Europe, didn't help that there's Brexit happening, and all these things tightening and sort of pulling back, and challenges as you needed to find ways to cut corners and costs. But we hung in there. We have to have moments that you touch, have to have love in them. So these are I'm giving a preview of the lift buttons that have their signage embedded in the point that you touch. And in New York, we had the funny project. Sometimes projects happen kind of wrong ways around. So we weren't asked to make an island in New York at all. We were asked to design. You see, I'll just go in here. Back to the mic. That was the old Pier 54, and they had an existing design. They were going to tear that down, and they were going to put a lump on the edge of Manhattan. So we're in New York on the west side, 14th Street, and they had a lump on the side that was kind of an interesting organic shape, if you were a bird. But it was flat as a pancake. And, there's a 9-lane highway there. And so the idea of relaxing next to the 9-lane highway was a funny thing. We had a chance in Shanghai 14 years ago to build the British Pavilion at the World Expo that some of you may have seen, which was the world's biggest hairy building. And the sponsor for this project, or potential patron of it, had seen that and sort of said, well, we should build one of those there as a kind of performance thing. And so we were invited into a competition for a thing, and they were going to spend all this money on this design that was great if you were in a helicopter. And so our proposal that didn't meet the brief was, why don't you forget the funny thing, and why don't we spend the money that you were going to spend on making a new pier that was actually a hidden pier? It was because it was actually just a larger bit of pavement next to the big road. Could we put the value into that and make that connect and have emotion emotional resonance for people. And in a way, every project, we're interested in what's your emotional journey as a passerby, as someone engaging with it, not actually, funnily enough, what's the theory we can put in a book. And it feels like too many things in my world of architecture become so theory-driven and can miss the experiential side too. And so we're fascinated by how do you juggle both theory but also feelings and treat emotion as a function. And here it felt like emotionally it was not a good use of money. So our proposal was that, okay, what if we do they wanted some plants, but they also needed this performance space, and they were thinking of that as a thing. But the piles, so if I just go back, you see just next to the thing I pointed at is a bunch of sticks sticking out of the water. And all the old piles sticking out of the river, the Hudson River, felt so romantic. So there's the water, and like there's these like pieces of wood that at different moments of tide are more or less visible, vanish away. But it sort of felt like little King Arthur swords leaning out of the water and then disappearing again. But there seemed such a shame that all of those piers have those structural piles that go down through the river silt till they reach the granite at the bottom of Manhattan. And the Manhattan, if this is Manhattan, the granite does this at the edges. So the further out the pier, the longer the piles go down till they get through all the mud to hit the granite that's underneath. And so they're like heroes. And it felt like, what a shame to just put a lid on it. And so that really led us to say, well, what if we say that the columns are the hero and we don't just let this be flat with a few plants on it? Because the emotion of trees and plants on a flat deck, you know it's just like roof gardens. So often it's nice, but you can feel it's just a roof. But in emotional terms, if we could three-dimensionalize that, we could even make a performing space, this outdoor theatre. And we could, in a way, hero the structural part that is exciting, it seemed to us. And so that led to Little Island. And we deliberately pushed it out as far. You saw when I was doing this diagram about the further we pushed it out, the longer the legs got. So there's this push and pull of like where our budget could afford invisible legs disappearing into mud. And that meant that we could have just very simple bridges, gangplanks across, just like if a ship pulled in, people throw down the gangplanks. But that meant you'd have a moment where you kind of go, ooh, as you leave behind New York and feel you're going to somewhere else rather than just a bigger bit of the pavement. So we're interested in that journey, and very deliberately you can see on the left, the main bridgeway in, you're going underneath it. And I've been interested in different people who've been thinking about emotion and how we respond to places. And archways, and that's something that China knows better than anyone, is the symbolism in your emotional response to going underneath gateways, the feeling you're in a different place, leaving behind something. And so we really wanted that. But first of all, it was to have an invitation, but not give it to you too quickly. So you've got to choose to go there, but it's inviting you, and you don't really want to be on a bigger piece of the land. You want to be over water. That's the theatre and drama of a pier. And so this is the project, it's there in amongst all the old piles. We refuse to let them take away any of the old piles. So actually what this means is, and it was lovely meeting a marine biologist who was saying, in effect, we're making a reef and enriching that reef with even more spaces for marine life to attach. And so as the years go by, those should be really rich, and it'll be interesting to study what that landscape under the water level becomes for the plant life and submarine animal life. And apparently there are boring sponges there. Who knew there were things called boring sponges? But we really fought to make sure we did have a moment of arrival that sort of might give permission for you to feel differently as you came through to a main space. And this main space is sort of lifts up so that you could have 2,500 people for a performance there, because the lawns all slope and point down to a main gathering space. But then there are there's a game in the UK called Snakes and Ladders. So we've got snakes that go around, and then also scramble ways and staircases, which are the ladders between. So there are shortcuts, longer routes, and deliberately quirks and surprises built into it. And our client kept saying whimsy, keep whimsy. And it's a funny word that we weren't used to using in projects, but that really mattered to them. But then there's also this 700-seat outdoor theatre looking across to New Jersey, with the water and the river as your backdrop. And then, I think this is the last one. In Singapore, I'm having worked on places where people are trying to sell things, it was really interested to work on a place where it's not selling anything. But the problem is that we're so used to universities with miles of dead corridors. And so when we were commissioned to make this new university building at Nanyang Technical University, the difference was our building was going to be a 24-hour building. And then when you were thinking about all these, the existing campus was built in the 1980s and has miles of these corridors with no natural daylight, polystyrene ceiling tiles. And you think, if you had a child, would you want your child at 2 o'clock in the morning down kilometre number 2 of these dead corridors? Is it even safe in that way? So we thought, how could we make a corridor-less university building? And that sort of led to saying, well, what if we make each of the learning spaces, and we were told no corners, so we obeyed. So each learning space has no corners. But then if we could make them so they all see each other, so there are no corridors and no corners to each of the learning spaces, but we deliberately make lots of nooks and crannies between them, because so often where you have breakthroughs or learning points is not where you're supposed to. And it's that moment after a lesson where I love those moments where everyone's there and walks out and goes, I totally disagree, or whatever it is, muttered to their friend. How do you have those spaces where actually you have those breakthrough moments? And so our problem was also that we had a budget that was only a little bit more than for a car park. And so we also wanted to get the highest possible environmental performance for an academic building. And so there's this thing called Green Mark Platinum. And the only way to get that, and then there's this buildability scoring in Singapore that's really harsh. The only way you could get the buildability score, which allows you to build, which doesn't like craftsmanship on site, the only way to meet the budget of a bit more than a car park and LEED Platinum was if the floors were concrete, and if the columns were concrete, and the cladding was concrete, and the cores were concrete. And when you say concrete that many times to someone from Northern Europe, their heart doesn't go, yeah. You kind of think of gloomy places and a kind of harsh brutality. And so we were just trying to think, how could we give love to concrete? And because we had no choice. And they were also saying, we will not be using high quality concrete. It will be the cheapest possible concrete. And some of the high quality concrete that's fetishized in the world of architecture is perfectly smooth, perfectly flat. And the molds are made from polished stainless steel, mirrored, so that the concrete is sort of totally smooth and flat. Whereas they were promising ours would have stones, stains, misalignment, and holes. And so we're thinking, right, actually, if we think of concrete like ceramic, when you go for a Japanese meal and you have the plates or for sushi or sashimi, quite often the ceramic is a bit wobbly and has little stones and lumps in it, and the glaze is a bit streaked. And the notion of wabi-sabi, which is sort of accepting natural imperfection, is something that feels gorgeous and cherished. But then when you get an absolutely perfect white plate, you think, is that IKEA? As you look underneath it, and thought, well, hang on, would we even want that perfection? Could we think of concrete like we think of ceramic? How comes we have a different mindset when it's concrete to that? And so the project is concrete. It's raw. It's rough. We worked with an artist who did 800 ink drawings, which we embedded into the building. It's kind of not one building. It's 12 buildings, which are just these piles of the classrooms. And then garden embedded on every floor, on all those nooks and cranny spaces throughout. And the heart of the space really was wanting everyone to be able to see each other, and using the natural non-straightness to make spaces where you can stop and gather and chat and feel that you can not just be whisked through. So its job is to be hyper-social and hyper-physical. And it feels in this time of hyper-digital, we cherish the hyper-physical more than ever. And I remember when people said, books are going to die because of the digital. You start to think, well, actually, everyone tries harder now. Books are more special, and people make a bigger effort. We needed to. Otherwise, yes, it should be a digital thing. And I think it's the same with public space, and it needs to be the same in buildings when you don't need to go to work anymore. You can stay at home and work. And you don't need to learn in a university. But actually, university should be where you meet your business partner, have a great idea, set up a charity. This must be a place of sort of seeding incredible conversation and making people feel encouraged to have the unconventional thought. And that doesn't matter. And frustrating, I don't actually have the killer image I wanted to show you of the artist's work, because we made molds of these and it is in the book, but of these 700 ink drawings, and we just three-dimensionalized them, and they become bigger than any stain or any bubble or misaligned formwork, and it almost feels like it was an old building as soon as it was built. And we developed a way in our studio we could make the molds to make all the surface on the outside of the building and expose the different stones, so that you could just use one mold that you could adapt and adjust to make the whole building without needing to buy lots of molds. And just on the left, you can see some of the artwork from this amazing illustrator called Sara Fanelli. And it was just a joy to use that and find a way to have fascination embedded in all the surfaces. So there's no panels to fall off. That's what's holding up the building, but also full of things to take your mind and engage you. And the building, as it's now 7 years old, and the plants are growing all over it, and you can go 24 hours a day. And I was there at 2 o'clock in the morning, one of my last visits, and there were students all sitting around and it was, I think that was a good sign. Maybe that's a bad sign they're out there at 2 o'clock, but I took it as a good sign, so I'm telling you as if it's a good thing. And so finally, on Saturday, I'm off to Xi'an in China, where we have worked on a project with CR Land, which is a big project that involves 4 towers, the kind of mix that happens of workspaces, hotel spaces, and living spaces, and a street, and cross routes. And the challenge is bigness. How can we break bigness down? And so we were interested in how we could we got fascinated by ceramic. I was just talking about thinking of it as ceramic, and China has whole city of ceramic. And so I just thought, we can't miss this opportunity. And so often big projects, again, you get to this distance and, just looking at a piece of aluminium, what's that going to do, or shiny metal? And so we've been working with neuroscientists on a campaign called the Humanize campaign, and we've been learning how our brains actually go into stress when we don't have a necessary amount of visual complexity. It's funny because we sort of fetishize less is more, but in a public setting, in our streets and towns, less isn't more. We've had disasters as we've made places with no, which we describe as characterless, we describe as sterile, but actually they're lacking of visual complexity. And what we've been learning from the neuroscientists that we're working with is that we are infovores. You know, our brains actually need nutrition, just like we talk about the low levels of nutrition in ultra-processed food. We've had the equivalent of ultra-processed architecture. And so how can we work with the modern materials and budget, but find ways to build some complexity? And so these tables, which you saw are all interlocking with each other, are all made from ceramic with glazes, which are all different. So every piece is unique. And this is my last slide, a little sneak peek of within the project is a bit of the project that I thought would never happen, called the Xi'an tree. And it's a 17-story garden, because Xi'an was the end of the Silk Route and Xi'an was the capital of China. And so from Europe to Asia, the route was all heading towards Xi'an. And so we proposed an idea of taking the 7 different types of plants on the route from Europe to Asia and growing that into a 17-story structure. And I always thought it would get cancelled. I was just waiting. I didn't want to tell my team how much I thought it would get cancelled, but it's actually happened, and it's opening on Sunday. So that's a sneak peek from a few weeks ago, but I hope you'll come and visit it. But it's what do you do when there aren't old buildings? Because so often it's old buildings that give soul and spirit. And what do you do when there aren't any old buildings? How do you have things that trigger conversation and fascination? And so actually it's a big challenge for now. I think we've learned better how to renovate old buildings and cherish them. And they were the IKEA sheds of their day, and yet they're so often the best bit of any new development is just the industrial buildings. But when you don't have any, what do you do? So I hope you'll come to Xi'an and see the project. Thank you.
Thank you. That was way that these things always start. Does this mic work? Yeah, thank you for that. It was really interesting. I think what I was struck by, so we've got about half an hour. They're probably going to scream at me because we're not supposed to have half an hour, but anyway. We've got about half an hour, and the plan is that we want to keep this as an open conversation. So, we're not going to just sort of make you ask Q&A at the end. If there are any questions you would like to ask at any point, please do just put your hands up. There's a mic at the floor. If anybody has a question right now, we can even start with a question if you would like to, or we can ease our way in. I mean, what I was struck by while you were reading the book, Making, and also... Oh, is there one? I can't see. Sorry.
Hi. So I've worked as an architect in Hong Kong for about 6 years now. And I was living in the city, and I recently moved over to Lantau Island. And I realized recently that instantly by moving, my stress levels went down. And one of the reasons for that was, rather than waking up and looking at a concrete wall that I did for the last 5 years, I now look at trees and greenery. And the other element is I now cycle to the ferry to get to work, which means that I slow down and there's this sense of community, and you get to know people around you, and you say sort of hello on the way. And I guess one thing that really inspired me throughout my career in your projects is how much greenery you manage to get onto your buildings. And I found quite often here we try and convince our clients to put greenery onto the buildings, and there's this real resistance to have the maintenance and to have to look after those green spaces. And often, even if we convince our clients to have sort of outdoor spaces, they tend to get tiled or have these hard surfaces. And again, with sort of rising temperatures around the world, having these green spaces in cities is really important to sort of lower those temperatures and bring a human scale to spaces. So I guess my question is, have you had any resistance from clients to put in these green spaces, and how have you managed to convince them that it's worth putting these in, and how have you convinced or put in, I guess, maintenance strategies or convince them to kind of go ahead with those and not for them to be sort of phased out as the project goes on?
Yeah, it reminds me of, people say never work with animals or children, and it's in the theatre or whatever it is, and there are many developers who just, and architects I know who I respect a lot, but they're just, I don't want anything living because living things can die, and if they die, it's my responsibility, and I've got to walk away. Who's going to look after it? I think I'm still in the naive optimism phase after 30 years. That I think it's important to hopefully make places that will inspire people to maintain and look after things and feel proud of that. But it is a risk. It's a risk to take because it's easier to not do that. But I think I had an emotional response to buildings and new pieces of city, which was just that feeling of how dry they were. Just everything was so dry, and the way dust sits on dry things, and there's something just felt wrong. I think in a way, I think when designers work well, that they are good at tuning in to actually quite simple truths and perceptions that you can perceive when you're 7 or 14 or 88, but sometimes you stop. Education can also educate you away from being tuned into just basic intuitions that are sort of eternal truths. And so I try to get pulled into all the sophistication, but also keep back to the sort of simple things and hold that and try to give space for those thoughts. The thing that shocked me as I have properly reflected, and this humanised campaign that I've got a looking H here for humanise on me, is that we have giant industries in the world and how measured the oil and gas industry is. The effectiveness of $1 in the oil and gas industry is absolutely analysed. The financial markets are so analysed. And one of the biggest industries ever in history is construction. And yet we have not measured at all. We go, no, it's an art. It's an art. If you don't like what I do, you're wrong. Or stupid, not well educated or something. And rather than seeing it as an industry that serves, it's an industry that's there to serve. And we should be fascinated to try and gauge how successful is a building to passers by, because most people will never go inside any new building. They're outside it. And I hear building designers talking about their clients and the client's need and how brilliant it was that they met their client's needs. And, that they wanted a big atrium, they wanted their fancy piece of artwork and a piano and a sort of amphitheatre staircase, and there's great ceiling heights and daylight. And you go, yeah, but only very privileged people will ever work for you or come into this building. What is this building giving anything back to society? And actually often, almost always, unless it's an art museum or a opera house, so often they're actually not generous. But every building is award-winning, as you probably noticed. And I think there were a whole lot of awards last night, and everything's award-winning. But who's giving that award? It's our bubble of our echo chamber. And so my long-winded answer is really saying there's a huge neuroscience side. And I think in the past we said, well, we can't discuss its beauty and that's subjective. And what's interesting is when you say, okay, beauty, okay, maybe it is subjective, sort of. I think how subjective, we can discuss that. But it's as if we're discussing, like, between here and here. You know, how you think this is beautiful and I think there's beautiful. What makes beauty? But actually the problem we have around us is that most things are absolutely terrible. And so we have an epidemic of boringness. And so we've used plants on our projects as an affordable way to get visual complexity. And what we found interesting was we met a neuroscientist, Colin Ellard, in Canada at the University of Waterloo, who's specifically studying how we respond to places. And you sound like you've been already a part of his studying, and not saying, do you like it or don't you like it? Do you think it's beautiful or not? But actually putting skin conductance readers on people and measuring their heart rate and body temperature. And what was so interesting was that all the subjects, and they just came to London and used our studio as the base to study another big group of volunteers, is that people in front of the shiny, flat, monotonous, anonymous, serious, plain buildings, compared to the not so flat, not so plain, not so shiny, not so anonymous, not so serious, their bodies start going into stress, like you were saying. So it's so interesting you're saying that. And so there's this thrilling opportunity, and we had the second Humanised Symposium we hosted in our studio, and we had 80 and it really was the top people, and a few flew in from different parts of the world, looking at how our brains and our emotions respond to place. And it's just not the prevailing atmosphere. If you're in architecture, you know the prevailing atmosphere in architecture is that if you don't like it, you must be something wrong with you. We even had the big architecture prize in Britain, the Sterling Prize, recently, and there was, I think, 6 or so candidates, and the public were asked to vote. So there was a public vote, and the public voted for this one, and then the judges said, this one's won. You thought, well, huh? How could... So the public are wrong. Nice that you voted, and very nice. But anyway, this is the winner. You thought, surely the judges' one should almost be the second one, and the public. And so I think we've got a weird mindset thing where we are forgetting our industry is to serve, and we must stop thinking we're right and have all the answers, but put yourself in the shoes of other people. And I think this mindset of being the art above all other arts isn't actually useful. And look what we've done over the last 80, 90 years.
And I think it's interesting within what you're saying, and what comes through very clearly in the book is this idea that also in the current mindset there's a huge division between what is an architect as a grand construct and what is a maker, which obviously making being the name of the book, but a craftsperson, somebody. I mean, I'm struck that you celebrate, ideas, you celebrate Christmas cards, you celebrate this idea of taking forms and turning them on their head, and this idea of the tactile role that you feel you have is often an insult that's thrown at architects as, oh, you're just a designer, and that there's somehow a hierarchy between these roles. But you seem to have built your career really on embracing all of these aspects and saying, for this building to be right and to be working and to fulfill its purpose, you have to be embracing all of these different elements. And I think that's really interesting, because you seem fairly unusual within your cohort in the field now to have managed to do that. I mean, was that a given for you? I mean, was that always a very natural progression for you, or were you under pressure to put aside the Christmas cards and the messing around with little stools?
You're saying I messed around with little stools?
In the best possible way.
I suppose I never felt I was interested to express myself. And I think this is there's a mindset of you're expressing yourself and you are the genius building designer. And I never felt that. I didn't see it that way. And I thought there was something felt not right to me. And also I looked at the buildings from when I was small. You'd walk out and see the new buildings, the 99% of them. You just thought, like, who built this? Like, why do we think that's good? What's happening? And so my motivator was the gap. I'm always interested in the gap. And instead of thinking you're expressing yourself, is what isn't happening. And I think that's a useful way. That felt automatic to me, but actually I now think we should all do that more. Is just think, well, what can we contribute that isn't being contributed at the moment? And so that's what we're always trying to look for in each project, is so it's the problem solving rather than manifesting in some way. And also, I mean, it's important to say that building design and city making is incredibly hard. I don't mean that from a pity me. I mean, it's when I started really indignant, actually, as I was doing my degree course at Manchester. The more I was looking at buildings and then was thinking, like, what? How can you do this? How did anyone let that happen? Who drew that? And then I spent a summer going for my dissertation when I was 20, going around. I had a little car and I put watermelons in the back as a gift for anyone I would interview. And I went and interviewed architects, builders, professors of architecture and design, because I came from a making background and it felt like Emperor's new clothes. Everyone I met in that world had never welded, never done joinery, never mixed concrete, never laid a brick. And I just thought, never blown glass, thrown a pot. It was like, what? You're responsible for the biggest objects in the world, and too much emphasis seemed to me to be on celebrating theory, which is incredibly important. But you are also making the biggest objects in the world. And so you've got to be interested in objects as well. There are many times when an object isn't appropriate, but just there's a sort of fetishization where you hear and everyone nods when someone says, I'm not interested in building as object. I'm interested in space. And that sounds so good. And you think, oh, that's a deep, meaningful person. But actually, you need to be interested in the way you're going to frame that space, because it's stuff if you are going to do it. You don't have to. Sometimes our job is to talk ourselves out and talk our client out of building stuff, but finding the idea. And so I went around in my little car and I spoke to all these different people, and it just became clearer and clearer. It was looking at the making experience in the world of building. And if you think of head, hand, and heart, it felt that the last century had moved away from the hand, the craft, and I understand because industrial revolution is real and exciting and all these materials, away from craft, away from heart, and actually to the head. It was very heady, and that's what was celebrated. And so at the end of that dissertation, I realized, oh yeah, there's this big gap. And that was, but I also realized, but what my big lesson, I had a hunch of that, the research bore that out. But what I did learn from my sort of zeal and sort of anger, frustration, was I suddenly realized how hard it was to build anything, to actually get any building built. So I ended up with like too much sympathy. It's like, oh God, but that's actually the forces that against you building anything at all are really great. And that's when I also realized that you have to be a team. There is no one person who can conceive of a whole project, drive everything in that project. It is really, you are a group. And actually, it's about trying to make a really good group. And it took me a long time to grow within the studio. The biggest project, I mean, that's the essay bit in the front, and I struggle to write essays, so please do read it, because I actually wrote something there. It's called From I to We, because that was my biggest journey. as a partial introvert as well, is that I didn't want to be a boss. I didn't want to have a big gang of people, but actually finding how to be a group together and how you could harness yourselves all together to be able to do things that otherwise couldn't happen. And so that voyage for me was a big one, but also that it's really understandable why forces drive what gets built here. There is no simple person you can just go, it's their fault or their fault or their fault. But I think there is national conversation that needs to happen. And at the moment, there's a man called Simon Jenkins in the UK who just published a book about the history of architecture in Britain. And at the end, he goes through the history and then gets quite irate about what happened in the last 60, 70 years. But he says part of the problem is, and I think Britain might be worse than other places, is he said, we don't speak architect. Now, society doesn't. There's just no confidence to talk about buildings. They just sort of happen, and people think, well, I'm not a developer, I'm not a planner, I'm not an architect. And it just happens, and because they happen slowly, get demolished slowly, there's no sense of agency. And so the echo chamber keeps talking to itself and winning awards from itself. And actually, there's not a real connection between, actually, your job is to serve. Your job, if you're building buildings in the public realm, is to serve people. And you can't, if you genuinely think people are stupid, you shouldn't be doing what you do, because people aren't stupid. And if you think, well, they don't understand architecture, I've not actually met anyone who's not lived in a building all their life too. And so you share that. They may not be articulate, but their feelings are valid as much as yours are. And actually, often in our industry, we've actually lost touch with our feelings. So it's a funny one. We talk about EQ and emotional intelligence, but it's really hard to have all that technical know-how and the liabilities, which are really real, and financial responsibilities, but also try to keep in touch in the leading of these projects, to also keep a kind of what's the real emotional intelligence of this project. And that cannot be, is it a crazy shape? Does it look like a Sydney Opera House? It's actually not. It's about the small details. And my projects aren't really the best example, because really our real issue is the 99% of buildings. I've found myself being commissioned for the kind of 1%. But how do we actually get a languages and details? I mean, the Victorians, they built millions of boxes, but they built boxes with human detail. And so boxes make sense. So we shouldn't be like, everything shouldn't be a box. But actually, it's how do you build emotion into functional boxes that mean that you don't knock them down? That's the other thing. The big reason, even if you don't care about aesthetics, is we have our dirty secret, which is that the construction industry is responsible for 5 times the greenhouse gas emissions as the aviation industry. And it's like a dirty secret because we don't talk about it, because we're in our bubble, we don't need to. But actually, if the public really understood that, they would say, what the hell, every time a building is demolished? And why did we build a building that no one cared about enough to say, no, let's not knock it down. Let's renovate it, let's adjust it, let's repair it. So it's kind of, how can you make a building that someone you will never know, you'll never meet, might care enough? And a final thing I'll just quickly say and then shut up, is that sort of movement that came through scraped off in this line that ornament is crime, less is more, form follows function. I mean, they all sound like, yeah, like silly ornament, chuck out the chintz, less is more, yeah, like a Zen Buddha kind of thing. But when you actually put those together, and clean lines and subtle, you're actually making boring places, and places where you've, in effect, scraped the culture off, like you've bared things back down so that buildings don't tell stories anymore. And the head planner in Singapore said to me, she was really quite passionate about this, and said, buildings don't tell stories anymore. So I think there's an opportunity to adjust the business model and the mindset so that we start making places that aren't crazy shapes, they don't need to be, but just particularly the bottoms of buildings have story, have detail. And Hong Kong taught me it doesn't matter if they're a floor taller to pay for that. But we could have a revolution with involving illustrators, artists, theatre designers, craftspeople, collaborating, because it's a big collaboration anyway. And my team's 248 people, and it's not me, it's us. It's the we bit.
Yeah. I'm struck that some of the most interesting work, not some of the most interesting work, but budget crunches oftentimes stimulate a lot of inventiveness, a lot of imagination, a lot of success for you guys. I was fortunate enough to go to the expo site in Shanghai, and it was such a pleasure because it was a hot, barren, concrete landscape of big, epic exhibition halls that you would go into and exhausted by, and you would go in to the British Pavilion and it was an oasis. It was people lounging around on the AstroTurf taking a break and going immersing themselves in the Seed Cathedral. I mean, can you talk a little bit about like how the creative process is spurred on by budget almost, that not having money or not having the ability to do certain things can actually produce some of your most interesting and exciting work?
Yeah. That's a brilliant question, because I didn't come from a background of money, but I've always been interested in how you respond to things and how people feel about things. And every project, there's hardly ever any project that somebody says you've got whatever budget you need. That never happens. That might happen if you're making an artwork, but in architecture, the mindset is everything has to kind of earn its keep. So you have to justify everything from a financial point of view. And so I think that's what I've really enjoyed learning, if I reflect back, is where is real value? Because you can never do everything you want to do. So the thing that is one of our values in the studio that we talk about a lot is focus. And I think most projects get confused in that you see often. They're a kind of mishmash of lots of things. And you're trying to distill, like, what's the focus of this? Because if you know what the focus is of your project, you know where to spend your money and where to spend less money. And the British Pavilion is a great example one to pick, because we were given half the budget of the other Western nations. And there were going to be 250 pavilions at the expo. And you know how there's the sort of polite British mannerisms of the Foreign Commonwealth Office and the Department for Trade and Industry, and they wrote their brief and they said, show that Britain is a good place to do business, and show that Britain has lots of heritage, and show that Britain is very diverse, and show that Britain's got good food. And then you're there going blah, 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 because every country is going to say that about themselves. But then there was just one line at the end, and it said, there's going to be voting. Make sure you're in the top 5. And we just thought, blah, 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 blah. That's actually the brief. Because each pavilion had a 3-hour queue on average. Crazy. So unless you're a kind of real demented expo fan, you're probably just going to go for one day to the expo, maximum 2 days. And so how many can you see? So if you go for one day, you're probably going to see 6. You'll look from the outside, but you might get inside and see 6 pavilions or so. So you're going to think really carefully about which 6 you're going to invest 3 hours in or 2 hours in queuing. So in a way, it was interesting to get into the psychology of it. And we realized that where pavilions tended to go wrong, again, it was all through analysis. And I find it really funny when people go, oh, and you're like an artist. And you think, I'm not. You don't realize. What we do is try to it's all in the analysis. And when we analyzed pavilions at expos before, what tended to happen was everyone gets given a site the size of a football pitch. We were all given 100 meters by 60 meter site. And the way that the process went is about 3 years before the expo happens, there's the competition for it. what happens is the competition drags on and all the architects in the country go in for the competition, and everyone gets that site and goes, all right, 100 metres by 60 metres, and builds a building as big as their design is for a 60 metre by 100 metre building. And there was also a regulation that it couldn't be taller than 20 metres. So 60 metres by 100 metres by 20 metres high is actually, even in a photograph, is like a long, thin thing. And I'm going to show you now how fully evil our brain was. Photographs in magazines aren't long and thin. Photographs in magazines are a bit like the screen here. There's a certain proportion. So if you make a long, thin building, imagine a photograph of it. There'll be a lot of sky and a lot of paving, and your photograph won't look, it'll look like, oh, it's quite small. So we thought, well, we can't afford to make a building that is 100 metres, that's that proportion. So what if we make only a sixth of the site be memorable, and we make 5/6 forgettable? Now that's really kind of a funny conversation to have to a group of enthusiastic, passionate architectural designers, is to say, and you do the forgettable bit, and we'll over here let's do the memorable bit. But that was strategy, because also what we saw was someone would win that competition for that country, and so there was a design for this huge building. They would then go out to procure it, time clocks going down, and eventually they get the full budget for it, and then they all go, oh, it's over budget, it's too expensive. Then they go, oh, well, it's too late, we have to build it. And then they go, oh, we haven't got enough money for contents. Then they go, oh, let's put films inside it. And so what always tended to happen when you went to expos is they were all, that you'd go into every pavilion, there was just films inside it. And so we just thought, that's interesting. And the other thing was, the other bit of analysis was, for some reason, countries always were so cheesy about themselves. And you were there going, uh-oh, Italian one, is it going to have spaghetti? Yes, it had spaghetti. And you go, has it got Ferrari? Yes, it's got Ferrari. And you just thought, if you're making somebody choose which queue to go in, if you think you know what's going to be inside somewhere, you're not going to go to it. And so our argument to the British government is, everyone's going to think it's going to be about rain. Everyone's going to think it's going to be about Sherlock Holmes and castles and queens and Formula One. What if we don't make it a thing that everyone knows already? What if we said something fresh about Britain? And the whole expo is about the future of cities. And actually, British cities are some of the greenest in the world for their size. And the world's first major botanical institution was in the UK, Kew Gardens. And so we took very seriously, okay, let's really do something that's serious. And so we spoke to Kew, and they agreed to give us 250,000 seeds. And we just thought, okay, love David Beckham, but we're not having David Beckham in our pavilion, because we know that already. And so that led to the Seed Cathedral, and we also analysed what were the styles of architecture that were considered new and contemporary. And there are patterns. You just pick up magazines. You can see the trends. So just thought, right, these are the trends. Don't do the trends of what people will think is original. So predict what original thinks it'll look like, and then by the time it's built, and actually many people have done a similar thing, so it's like double stepping over that. And so that led us to texture, extreme texture. And so that led to us making something. Also, you only have focus. If we do one thing well, that might stick in your memory. Your people are exhausted. Shanghai is hot, humid. It's horrible. Imagine your worst ever day of going to every shop and every museum in a city. You're just exhausted wandering around. Only something powerful breaks through your kind of fatigue. And so again, trying to think through what condition someone is in. They're not in a lecture hall. They're tired, they've got bags of all the stupid freebies that they're going to throw away later. And so it was that line of analysis that said, actually, if we do the smallest pavilion at the expo, it'll look the biggest in the photos, and could we make it communicate its contents and be impossible to put a film inside and actually be the most biodiverse point in the whole of Asia? And it was funny presenting to the British government multiple times because the ministers kept having scandals and disappearing. So we had to keep selling it again and again. We had 6 different ministers. And I remember one minister coming in and kind of going, looking at all his aides and kind of going, why are we doing a nut shop for the British Pavilion? And I was going, it's not a nut shop. It's my argument was that the most risky thing the British could do, where we would waste the British taxpayers' money, is to show Sherlock Holmes and the Queen again, because less people will come. And it was one of those times where it's possible you had an analytical 6 months, you could quantify how many people came, we won the top prize at the expo, and it's only through analysis and that focus, and we managed to tell a story to our government that showed the safest thing you could do was make something. The best business plan you could have was to do something that would engage people's emotion and be fresh in their mind, and to think through how someone would feel and put yourself in everyone else's shoes. It was an interesting process, but in a way, in each project, you're trying to do that process, and that's where it's this sort of journey of learning and focusing, and the discipline of the money just tightens your brain and makes the importance of focus even clearer.
Amazing. They're signaling that we have to finish. Can we sneak in one question? Yes, we can. Can I get it as a question? Lucky who? Do you want to pick, Thomas?
Hard to go for it.
There's a microphone.
I'm really curious about the badge that you refer to, your H, because you, in your whole approach with architecture, is you've gone true to your core, to your honesty, whereas most architects nowadays, like you said, that 99% do something that's sterile, that's based on the money and how much more you can get for the buck. So what is the legacy of the H that you want to leave behind, the human element, and how do you think that might impact architecture in future?
Okay, you're touching on a slightly sensitive subject for this evening, because I'm here to promote the making book with Thames and Hudson, which we've been lucky enough to do. However, once you have bought the making book, there's a cheaper book that's black and white, not full colour, but I was just really struck in that in the world of design, building design, we all have our book or books, and here's me and my work, and there's these sort of the people and their practices, but I was just really struck that in the world of food, that there are people who have bigger points that they're making beyond here's my recipes or here's my restaurant. And, in the welfare of poultry, there are some people within the industry who have a platform, and they've used their platform not just to have great restaurants or great recipe books, but they've pointed out and taught us about how so much industrial poultry, the chickens and chicks are treated, and actually horrified us and educated us and sensitized us to the point where actually in supermarkets and in society we've decided to not accept some of the treatment of the things that we take into our bodies. And there's also different people in the world of food who have said, look what we feed our children in schools, and sensitize. Everyone just took for granted that school food was really not great. By the way, I liked school lunches, but I can't talk about that. My mum's cooking was terrible, so I thought it was good. But most people, it's, their experiences of pretty low nutritional value food, and there was someone in the world of food who shone a light on that, and kind of a nation all went, yeah, what the hell? What are turkey Twizzlers? made out of reconstituted bits of turkey, turned into these funny twisty things, and it got banned. And in the same way we talk about nutrition, I just find we've had a catastrophe in cities and towns around us. And if you're not in the industry, you nod to me when I say that, because you kind of go, yeah, they're all sterile, characterless. And when you then understand the demolition that goes with that, and then rebuilding of no less boring buildings again and again, and once you really see the environmental impact of that, it's actually really shocking. And so I suppose in working in my studio, I just want to design. I don't like the sound of my voice. I get sick of myself very quickly. And so, but then I realized some of the people who I really looked up to when I was growing and who did stand for some things to do with public space, and really they spoke things that lifted me and what I did, and facilitated some bigger conversations that felt important to happen. They've passed away now or have moved out, and it just suddenly thought, where's everyone else? No one else is really talking enough about these things. And our industry just talks to itself and gives awards to itself and is very happy with itself in a way, and perpetuates and kind of shrugs its shoulders and goes, oh, well, that's commercial reality. It isn't commercial reality. If society says this isn't acceptable, developers are very practical. They'll go, all right, I'll make it a bit more engaging. I'll work on the first 40 foot. If I look stupid, if I don't, I'll do it. But it's only when society talks, and it was a bit like school lunches. Everyone knew school lunches weren't good, but it was only when society talked that suddenly school committees, governors of schools went, oh yeah, what is the vitamins left? How long did that vegetable sit in a pan of water? And there's vitamin levels were analysed, but it's the same with buildings. It's nutritional value of buildings. And 40 years ago, you were a freak if you brought seaweed into school with your sandwich, or you had a dried banana that looked like a cat poo that you were bringing in to eat, because everyone thought, what's that? Why aren't you just eating fish fingers and baked beans? But look at us now. Everyone thinks about the quality of the nutritional value, and ultra-processed foods we question, absolutely, and know they're not good. But we've kind of got ultra-processed buildings, and we think it's inevitable. We think we're powerless, and unless there's a bigger conversation. And so the humanized book that we did, which no one's allowed to buy, by the way, unless you've bought a copy of Making, is really a beginning of a campaign. And it was published a year ago, and we now have a module in a university in the UK, a master's degree, is developing a humanized module for the students about treating emotion very seriously as a function. There's a new architecture and design school in Columbia where the whole curriculum is going to be grown around emotion as a function, necessary visual complexity, and and there have been 2 of the symposiums happening, and we've got different property developers becoming partners, and it's emerging science, and so really researching how our brain, the neuroscience of it. So it's really exciting, actually. But I never saw that I would be a campaigner at all. I'm dying for everyone else to take this on, and so I can carry on designing. But it feels that actually, if you really care about improving the public world around, the reality is we do 4 projects a year, or 5 projects finished. That sounds like a lot. There's thousands of drawings on each one, keeps us very busy. That doesn't change the world. And it's only when the bigger conversation happens that we will actually improve cities and towns from a humanistic point of view. And so I'm a reluctant campaigner, and the Humanise campaign is around that. And if you look up online, become a member. I'm really excited. I learnt a lot of the things from here, because everyone in the UK complains. They think architecture, say in London, it's like bad because of how tall it is. So you have things go, oh, terrible in London, the towers. Like how tall, you've seen how tall those towers, as if you took 2 or 3 stories off the towers, or 10 stories, that would change it. And actually it was Shung Wan, here that taught me. Really tall towers, but they've got small bums. And you walk along a street and there's vitality at the street. So actually the challenge is don't worry about how tall it is. Let the developer have 2 more floors and then use the money they make from that to make the bottom be interesting. But actually door distance, that experience, the visceral feelings that materials and textures give you, and the opportunity, and ornament isn't a crime, and there are ways to do it without it feeling like a stuck-on thing, but feeling like it's embedded and integral and really of the building. So my hope is that just as now, 40 years later, ultra-processed food, nutrition is being discussed, they sort of think, oh, well, you can't change it, Thomas. Yes, you can. In 20 years, 30 years, if you just gently change the conversation, society will shift it. We will shift it if those conversations happen. And it was my last point then about that was just, I learned that from the chief medical officer of the United Kingdom. Dame Sally Davis, I'd been interviewed and asked what was my dream project. And I'd said, oh, hospital. And when asked why, I said, because they're the worst places I know of. I'm most embarrassed of my world and society that we live in, that we care homes, hospitals, and the medicalised environments are seemed some of the most unloving places possible. And so the next week I was contacted by the chief medical officer. She came to my studio and we had a conversation and she educated me. And she was saying, well, you do know I'm not in charge. I was like, aren't you? I thought she was. And she was like, no, it's broken into all these different health trusts. And so I was like, okay. And she said, look, every health trust is run by a manager, and that manager's busy, struggling, coping. She said, the only way you'll make change is with patient pull. And I thought, patient pull? What does that mean? And so she was saying, well, and this is me paraphrasing, was if patients speak up, say you're building a new cancer care centre, and somebody says, well, oh, you're building a new cancer care centre, and the patient says, oh, have you seen the one in Dundee, the one made from wood? It's really great. It really feels good for the patients there. Or, oh, have you seen the one in Leeds with the trees and plants all over the roof? It's really... So basically, the thing that hit me as quite a profound point was that half-decent leaders don't actually lead, they listen. But unless we speak, a leader, a politician, a chief executive, what do they do? And there's no public conversation about buildings. There is about flying. For our family, should we fly? The greenhouse gas emissions. Not about buildings. But so the humanised side of the book is written for a 15-year-old or 99-year-old. It's about not people in our industry, trying to be outside of that echo chamber. And so I do believe real change can happen. And it's already, we're starting to see very meaningful momentum, and 11 different countries publishing the book and things like that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. So I think...
So I get to close. Well, I'd like to say thank you for everyone, and we ran a little bit over time, although thank you, really, giving us your time here tonight, Thomas. I learned a lot. Something I took away from here tonight is how things look, how they feel, and how they make us feel. And tonight I feel very enriched and nourished by tonight's conversation. So thank you, Jo, and thank you, Thomas. And thank you, everyone. So please take your book to the gallery, and Thomas will be joining you at the gallery soon to sign your books.